Hi, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Nancy Patton, and I assist with growth and communications here at Saltmarsh. And I'd like to welcome you guys to our CMMC webinar. If you're a regular guest, welcome back. And if you're here for the first time, you can find our on-demand recordings and materials from previous webinars, including our last CMMC ones, on our Resource Center and YouTube channel. This is the third in a series we're holding on the CMM space. And today's program will cover everything you need to know and where to start after you've done your plans of actions and milestones. We are joined by our two IT security experts, Stefan Reyes, shareholder and provisional assessor with the CMMC Accreditation Board, and then Jason Keith, who's our senior technology risk consultant, and he is a registered practitioner with the CMMC Accreditation body as well. Thank you guys for leading today's presentation. And before we get started, I have some few housekeeping notes. Everyone on the line has been muted, and if you have any questions during the presentation, we invite you to share them in the Q&A feature, and we'll answer those questions if we have time at the end. And you're also welcome to share your questions with us by email to info@saltmarshcpa.com, and someone from our team will follow up with you. And after leaving our webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a short survey. It's really quick, and we'd love to hear your feedback. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason and Stefan.
Thanks, Nancy. Well, thanks for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate the opportunity to, in going through this series, every time we develop one of these webinars, we realize it makes us refine our thought process about how we're thinking about CMMC. And if you followed us the last couple of ones we've looked at, this is an evolving process. So seems like each week there's some new information, there's some new thought perspective. There's a few things that we'll be sharing today as we go forward as far as that goes. But the way we've kind of typically done it, the first two we did have really focused on NIST and have focused on POA&Ms and focused on the stuff that we're all already required to do, if we have CUI. Now we're going to stop and kind of pivot and move forward into CMMC, and maybe just some good suggestions from our part on what it is, how to approach it, how to maybe get started in preparing yourself for this new world where we'll have regular assessments coming every 3 years. So kind of in the look back process, what we started with, I mentioned, was the 800-171, which is really CUI NIST standard. We're already doing that. Then they introduced this self-assessment that we must do and reporting our score. We talked through that. If you're interested in it, go back and watch some of the previous webinars that we put out. And then we've kind of spent some time talking about, hey, if you're good at that, if you get all that together, you're very close to getting through level 3 of CMMC. So there's a lot of crossover, a lot of similarities. Now we'll also spend some time talking about the differences today now that we're moving in the CMMC side. And then also one thing that we've really kind of been trying to bring up each time is just thinking about just what a broad perspective and broad approach that this new standard is going to have. The expectation is most everybody within the defense industrial base environment, 350 to 550,000 companies, it depends on who you talk to in their assessment, it's going to pull you in because of federal contract information, because of having CUI. So just kind of keep in mind that even if you haven't had to follow through with the NIST, I think as we talk today, you'll realize, oh, wait a minute, I may have to step up and start doing some work on the CMMC stuff. Contract flow down has been a big piece, so that's something that we've talked about each time. So I want to keep in mind, if you're not the prime contractor, that doesn't mean you're not going to have to worry about this. You're not going to have some sort of certification. So one of the common themes is, all right, if the prime works with the Defense Department and they have a requirement, they're going to have to flow it down and push it down to those that they're working with. If you're a prime, you need to be thinking about that, flowing it down. If you're not a prime, you need to be watching your contracts probably for that to flow down to you. And then we spent almost the entire time last time talking about just the POA&Ms. And while even though those go away in the CMMC world, they're a good process to help you build towards CMMC compliance, we think. So that's kind of looking back. Now, as we look forward, there's a few things that hopefully you'll take away from today from watching this and from hearing us talk. One is that there are going to be some differences, and we're going to spend some time talking about the differences between what NIST 800-171 compliance looks like and what CMMC may look like. We're going to spend a little time helping you understand the framework itself. Now that it's out, now that we're moving forward, now that the process is going, and assessors are really starting to, you know, the C3POs are finally getting certified, and assessors are going to be starting to go through these processes where they actually evaluate companies. And it's good for us to get moving on that process. And also, we'll spend some time talking about scoping, and that's going to be a key component when you start thinking about how you want to evaluate your environment for CMMC. The scoping piece of it is going to be important, how you segregate your IT world. And then we'll spend time talking on the COI. There's been some recent good training and information put out there by the Defense Department. So we'll spend some time talking about that. And we'll kind of close out with, let's start at the beginning, CMMC Level 1 and what's in it and what you can be doing to kind of get started on understanding and approaching that.
So thanks, Jason, for getting us on track and putting us where we are. There's obviously a lot to digest in what's happening with CMMC. One of the things we like to do, you know, each time we come out here is talk about some of what the accreditation board is putting out to not only the people that are involved in the accreditation process, but also to the DIB in general. And it seems like at this point, pretty much monthly, they're holding what they're calling a roundtable or a town hall. I'm sorry, a town hall that they're putting out there and putting out some information. And we found it very informative about some of the upcoming process changes and what the DoD is thinking, because the DoD also participates in that town hall. So if you're not making those town halls, we do recommend you do. But if you'd rather just come see the cliff notes from us, we're happy to share that with you as well. But so this year, this month, they spent a lot of time talking about some of the nuances of the accreditation process for the trainers, for the assessors, for the people providing the learning material. A bunch of stuff that if you're interested in being an assessor or being part of that process is probably important and interesting to know, and it was certainly interesting for me, but probably not really the stuff that most of the people attending these kind of seminars are looking for. But that's where the majority of it was spent this year, or excuse me, this last meeting. But they did bring out some interesting nuggets about what they're looking for, coming forward. One of the things they're working on is dealing with how flow down will work within a contract. Jason had mentioned briefly there about the importance of flow down within a contract if you're a prime needing to flow that down to your subs. But some of the other questions that have come up is just because a contract has a requirement of level 3 because there's CUI involved in the contract as a whole, do all the subcontractors have to be level 3? And the DoD's response to that at this point is that that would not be the requirement, that requirement would adjust based on the level of access needed to information. But there's somewhat of a challenge of defining what parts of the contract will require what levels of CMMC. It appears from what the DoD is saying now is they expect to go into a little more detail in describing that in their contracts and actually describing what areas of the contract they expect to require what levels. I'm a little skeptical of that ability. That's going to take a lot of nuance and understanding of what information each level of that contract is going to need. And I think that, as we've said before, we think the tendency is going to be for them to require the highest level and basically play it safe in that manner. So I don't think that we're going to see a lot of detailed flow down information from the DoD, but who knows? We'll see how they work that process. But obviously, conceptually, you could understand how a contract in whole would have some CUI, but some of the subs may not need access to that CUI just to perform that contract. There depends. They may have some requirement for a certain level because they'll have FCI, but not CUI, so maybe they need level 1, but they don't need level 3. Well, which contractors need which? The question about where that requirement's going to happen at this point looks like it's going to be the responsibility of the prime to control that and ensure that people have the right level. But there may be some assistance from the DoD when they detail out the contracts of what levels are required. So there's still more to come on that. That's something that they're dealing with, something that they're thinking through right now. And certainly something that they're sharing with us that is in their mind. Another question that was asked at that meeting that was interesting, asked of the DoD, is that if a subcontractor could inherit 100% of their CMMC compliance requirements from the prime. In other words, if you completely worked in the CMMC, or excuse me, in the prime system as a sub, could you be covered under their CMMC compliance or their CMMC certification levels? And the DoD's hesitant response to that was, possibly, but we can't imagine how that could actually work. So it doesn't sound like they're supportive of that of that concept, although we have seen in the marketplace several vendors are starting to come around to start to talk about having CMMC certified systems or enclaves that they can sell you as a package that you can stay within. So it'll be interesting as that market defines itself and to understand what the DoD ultimately accepts and what gets certified. But that's another thing that is that's in talks, and they're thinking through at this point. There also was some mention about an update or a new version of the CMMC. We are still in essentially rulemaking at this point. So once that's completed, they expect that they will have some alterations to CMMC. We're not expecting any major changes in it. Perhaps there will be some changes on applicability as they try to get it to be more applicable across government agencies more than just DoD. There may be some things about reciprocity that keeps coming up about reciprocity. So maybe we'll see some additional definition in reciprocity, and certainly there'll be some more definition in the higher levels of the portions of the 4 and 5 that are still somewhat undefined, but they expect that to happen when rulemaking is completed. The other big announcement was that there is a new CEO or a CEO, a first hired CEO for the CMMC-AB, and that is Matt Travis, who has a long work history of working with the DoD and government agencies, and certainly seems excited to lead that organization. But that is essentially what we saw from the AB's town hall this month. As I'm That's my slides here. The other thing that we've come up with is a lot of questions about the difference between 800-171 and CMMC. This specific slide says 800-171 and CMMC Level 1, which is certainly what we're talking about today is some of the initial portions. But beyond that, we continually hear people talk about the differences or the similarities, or is CMMC really just 171? And there are some specific differences we want to talk about. One is that CMMC Level 1, quite frankly, is a lower burden than the 800-171. Now, of course, 800-171 is essentially formed to be able to cover those who are handling CUI, whereas CMMC Level 1 is really just for those who can handle FCI and not CUI. So that's one big difference. And there's certainly a requirement in CMMC Level 1 that you have to have an outside assessor, right? That's an independent assessor that comes from the CMMC-AB, assesses your organization and validates that you're at that level, whereas the 171, even though it's a much more onerous process to complete and be compliant with, you're really assessing yourself and determining whether you're in that compliance. So that's certainly a difference. The main difference, which we've been hammering on throughout our sessions, and you'll continue to hear, is this no POA&Ms allowed, meaning that in the 171, it allows for, even if you're considering yourself completely compliant with 171, to have some POA&Ms, some areas that you're still working on, some areas that you're looking to continue to need improvement. And be considered compliant with 171, whereas that is not allowed even at Level 1 in the CMMC. There should be no POA&Ms. It's a pass-fail process. So if it's not complete, you're not certified. So that's kind of interesting to me, about how that difference will be. That you could be 800-171 compliant right now, handling CUI with POA&Ms, but they're saying that once you have CMMC provisions in your contract, that you couldn't even be Level 1 CMMC, even though you could be 800-171 compliant. So there are several differences, but those are the key areas, and certainly the ones that you're going to see most of. Obviously, the CMMC, at least up to the Level 3, is based almost entirely on the NIST 171. So the majority of the components are very, very similar. The differences are how it's implemented and how it's going to be assessed. That's the two biggest differences. Jason, I thought you were going to say something there.
No, I'm good. I was just going to say that, we'll kind of flesh out a little bit more the lower burden level on Level 1, because we'll be talking about Level 1. We'll compare it to the NIST 800-171 later on the slide, so you'll get a better understanding of what we mean by that. And you'll get to see specifically how many practices and processes are involved in each, and you'll be able to tell the differences between. So it'll kind of make itself a little more apparent as we go through this process here.
And again, the DoD continually states that they expect most organizations will only require Level 1. And I continue to question that definition of what most contractors are going to be that can only need Level 1 for two reasons. One, as I stated before, and as Jason has stated in the past as well, is we expect that it will be the default for the DoD to consider a requirement of level 3, just because it's safer for them to say, it's all level 3, rather than have a problem where they don't say it's level 3 and their COI that's there and is not appropriately protected. So we think that there will be much more reliance on level 3 than level 1, but also just what we're seeing in the marketplace. Even though the DoD is out here saying most people will only need level 1, everyone we're talking to is asking to get to a level 3, and it kind of makes some sense, because to get to level 1 is relatively easy to accomplish what's necessary to consider yourself certified level 1, but you still have to go through that audit process. And the audit process seems to be the biggest deterrent portion. So if you're going to go through the audit process, it's not like if you become level 1, then you could come back and have an audit of just the gap or the delta between 1 and 3. No, you're going to go through the whole process again for level 3. So you might as well go level 3. And with the market seeing it that way, and the expectation that there will be a lot of assignment of level 3 requirements, just as a better to be safe than sorry process, we do expect that most people will ultimately be looking for level 3. Another thing they talked a lot about, and something we want to talk today about, was CMMC scoping. The comment here, it's all about the data. That's really how the DoD is defining where these requirements will be, where it will elevate it to a level 3, 2, or 1. And actually 2 is a transitional stage, so really that's almost a non-usable level, but it's about where the data is housed. And so when they talk about the possibility of segregating this requirement throughout the contract or throughout the subcontractors that would be involved in a single contract, that's what they're talking about, is if they can establish where the data will be and where the data will need to be held and where the data will need to be accessed. But more than that, within your organization, you got to think about scoping your CMMC enclave, or your area that's going to be CMMC certified. Our expectation is that many organizations at a much smaller level than would have been in the past will actually bifurcate their organization to some extent, meaning that they're going to certify a portion of the organization, not the entire organization. Most of what we see in the market are groups or organizations that do work for the DoD, but also do commercial work. Or they'll do certain levels of DoD work that may require CMMC certifications, but they also do other work that would not require that high level. And in order to do that, it's very difficult to certify the entire organization. So we're seeing more and more discussion and more interest in the idea of creating enclaves, both in your network space and your computer infrastructure, but even within your organization, naming specific individuals, specific roles who would have the ability to have access to CUI, and by restricting it to the number of people, you can restrict the areas you have to have certified, even to the extent of having separate information systems, complete separate computer systems for your CUI-based contract. And so you can see a day where you'll have an individual that may have more than one computer system. They may have one computer system that they use for CUI access, and then another computer system that they use for the items that don't require CUI. Even to the level we've heard some organizations talking about having systems for contracts, meaning that as part of reporting for a contract, they'll consider the cost and the need for that contract to have separate information systems just for that contract. So this laptop, this server, this cloud-based implementation of GCC High or whatever they're utilizing will be established for that contract and that contract only. That way they're not worried about mixing the CUI or understanding where the CUI will go throughout their organization. And then they would keep some of their administration information about the company and other work that's not DoD required, perhaps, on completely different systems. So that idea of an enclave is something that we encourage y'all to think about how you might be able to do that to your systems as you go through the process of putting yourself in a position to be certified. We talked to several areas several organizations that have that consideration. When you also think about scope, think about where the data is. Remember, that's what we said, is that depends on where the data is at. And so the data can be in several places. It can be on your information systems locally in your organization. They can be in cloud-based hosted. You can get it to your subs. But something that we think is interesting, and they did talk a bit about this in the town hall, and that is, what about working from home? People who are working from home bring up a whole nother part of the organization that may have access to CUI and may contain CUI, And we think about how do we protect that? How do we make sure that that information has the level of protection that is required for all CUI that's going to be within the organization? That could be as simple as, someone could be people actually printing CUI at home, which, many times we try to avoid having printers at home to avoid that. It could be just the exposure to their screen, meaning that they have a system that looks into some type of terminal service or some kind of remote system. So they're actually not transferring CUI locally, but their screen has access to CUI. So they're still expecting you to have appropriate controls, or for that end user to demonstrate they have appropriate controls over that system, so that when they're using that system, others aren't seeing the screen, or so that if that screen is open and available, others don't have access to it, meaning that they have a locked office or some way to secure that area from other people who may be members of their household. Even when when that question was brought to DoD was about auditing that process. And the statement was made that they would expect, if there was access to CUI in a remote manner, that should be part of the scope of the audit process, and that at least a sample set of home offices may be required to be included in the visits or the audit process, or seeing that these things are being upheld. So you're definitely going to expect to have your policies and procedures cover these items. So by covering these items, I mean being specific about what a home user would have or would need to have in order to access these systems in their homes, but then also have some policy and procedure that you see follow up to ensure that those are being adhered to. And then expect that if you get a CMMC audit, when it comes that time for certification, that there may be a visit to at least a sample or a subset of the organization or the individuals that are working outside the office and where those locations might be.
Stefan, if you have a second, would you go back one slide? I just, because we won't have a definition somewhere else perhaps, just to, I guess maybe to let it land, because it kind of helps a lot with the conversation later. FCI is something that's kind of a new thought process for a lot of us. CUI has been around for a while, even though they're still trying to figure out how to label it and exactly what it is at times. But FCI is the thing that really, the thought is really going to expand how many people have to, or how many different entities have to comply with CMMC. And if you look at the definition here, and this is a little bit, I guess, a bit of a dumbed down definition in a way, but it's basically going to be, if you're dealing with a government contract, a federal contract, and I think this we will see eventually expand outside of the DoD into just the broader federal world in general. There's a lot of rumblings that's the case. Any kind of work product there, any kind of information there that you're developing as part of that, or that you receive in the contract, if it's not supposed to be public, then it's FCI. And so if you're doing work with the Department of Defense or on behalf of in some way, shape, or form, you're probably going to, at a minimum, have this. There's going to be very few limited exceptions where you won't. And so that's the piece that brings in so many additional entities. Now, we'll discuss, CUI also in a minute, and chances are more of you will have it than think that you will. But that's kind of where this office, this picture here of like this small little office, we were trying to figure out how to make it look like an enclave. Like what does that look like? And it does sound silly, he mentioned it, but it's going to be odd in that it could be that it makes sense for you to have one employee with 2 computers or 3 computers or 4 computers, depending on the situation, how you want to segment things out. Because if your business is doing lots of non-government work and just a little bit of government work, you may not want the entire system to be evaluated. You may not need it to be evaluated. You just have to control where that information is. And so thinking about it a little bit on the upfront side is going to maybe save you money in having the review done when it comes down time for the certification assessment, and also going to save you a lot of additional expense and effort in not having to do all of these things to your entire network, though they're all great things, frankly, and they're not bad things to do from a cybersecurity perspective. But the more that you kind of can, I guess what we're trying to get out of this conversation, the more you can sort of limit and push data into one section, it's okay to just say, well, here's the 3 machines and here's what they touch and what they do. That's what your CMMC assessment will be. And so then you can imagine it'd be easy for somebody like Stefan to come in and evaluate 4 or 5 machines instead of 150 and a whole network environment. If policies, procedures, and practices can be refined to a smaller area, then maybe that will help everybody in the process. So I think what makes sense to get from this is be thinking now, is there a way that I should segment my network, segment my data, and make sure that I can put things in a smaller area so I don't have to look at everything. And then that next slide, I think you may have mentioned it, Stefan, but it was funny that right after they, right after the town hall meeting where they talked about work from home, they had somebody had their kid, got on the Twitter account and actually tweeted for the strategic command. And that was what, I guess, last 2 weeks ago at this point. So, it's kind of funny. While that's not really a big event, it does kind of, I guess, drive home the fact that I think the DoD has been very specific about wanting someone on site to review each contractor. They don't want a lot of remote assessments. They want people to go there and physically see, because one of the big things we'll talk about even in level 1 is physical security. This is another example of, well, maybe it makes sense then to extend that metaphor to work from home. And so to the extent that people have the ability to access things outside of the office, then there may be a need to go to employees' homes and see, are doors locked, or policies being followed, or practices being followed. So while nothing may come from that over time, we'll see, because that's a heavy lift. If you think about a large contractor that has maybe 50,000 people working from home, how are you going to get comfortable with those areas? But there's still something to be said for, there's going to have to be a lot of thought process about, you can't just take the laptop and go and print out at your desk there at home and throw it on the bed and kind of work from there. There's going to be some specific policies and processes you're probably going to have to follow with this information, especially as it digs into the CUI perspective. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Stefan. Just kind of wanted to push on through there a little bit.
So that's great. It is interesting how the DoD is dancing with that on-site portion. When we were working at defining the CMMC-AB's implementation, sorry, I'm trying to make this thing stop making sound. When we were working on that process and defining it, DoD was very clear that these assessments must be done with an on-site component. There was absolutely no exception for that. It was interesting when we said that, because we as defined, a contractor could be literally one person with a laptop out of their home, and that could be a contractor, and they still we were not going to push or allow pushback on, there will be an on-site component for every audit. Obviously we had a pandemic between now and then, and that has somewhat softened their stance. And they're not saying that will have to happen on every audit, but they're not saying it won't have to happen on every audit either. So I think we're still, time will tell on that, but they are still very adamant that there will be likely an on-site component to every audit. So I expect that'll continue, and as with the definition of where CMMC levels would be for each portion of a contract, when you can unravel that and see how many hundreds of thousands of subs could be involved in these areas, and to be able to define that, how that's almost unreasonable to expect it could happen. I think this is the same kind of concept that Jason brought up about auditing every work from home user. I mean, it's really unreasonable to expect that they're going to be audited every one, although I think they'd like to. That we will expect that there will be some kind of subset that will be reviewed, or some sample, or some process. So the biggest portion of that is to make sure that you have that in your policies and procedures. And build that as part of your enclave process as well. Now, Jason also brought up, the idea of CUI. What's interesting is we keep mentioning that the DoD is working on defining what levels of CMMC will be required, and what contracts, and how they'll define that, and how they'll note it. What they're really working right now is training all their contracting officers on what CUI is. I mean, I understand that this is somewhat new for the contracting officers, just like it is for all of us. I mean, there's the idea of CUI has been around for a while, and a CUI is not exclusively for the DoD either. But within the DIB, the CUI is taking on much greater importance as we bring in the CMMC process. But they are putting out training for the contracting officers, and at the end of this seminar, we'll actually give you some of the references where we find some of this information. But we actually pulled this from the training that they're putting out, that the DoD is putting out for their contracting officers. This is how they're training their organization on how to identify CUI and how to think about CUI. And this was a very interesting comment here, because I've always thought of CUI to mean a lower level than confidential, because we have the truly classified information of confidential, secret, and top secret. I kind of thought of CUI as a layer below that, and you can see others have as well. That this is the graphic that they're putting on in their training to say that that's not the way they're seeing it. They're seeing CUI as they mentioned here, an equal but different level of requirement. Now, obviously, there may be higher protection requirements for some of the secret or top secret, or maybe even for the confidential, but they're saying it is equally as important. They have separate co-equal executive orders, as they've stated here. So it is interesting that this is how the DoD sees this, is just as important as classified information. So that is interesting to note, because obviously that tells you about the seriousness that they're taking with CUI. There's continual questions about marking and how to define what is CUI and what isn't CUI. And of course, the bottom line ultimately is going to become the CUI is whatever DoD says is CUI, right? That's ultimately what happens. But there is some questions about translation of the old for official use only versus CUI. And you can see in what they're stating here, again, this is from their training materials, that they're saying that just because it was for official use only doesn't mean it's necessarily CUI, although it could be CUI, and it doesn't have to be remarked just because it is CUI. It could be still listed as for official use only from legacy and be considered CUI, and all that circles around to say, again, whatever they say is CUI. But do think about that items that were previously marked as for official use only could likely indicate that there's CUI, and especially if you're trying to assess your systems right now and say, hey, do I have CUI now? Should I be doing my self-assessment and submission for 800-171? If you have documents that are currently marked for official use only, there's a very good chance that those could be items that will now be considered CUI. Not necessarily so, but there certainly could be that case. Again, the DoD, this is again a presentation from their perspective. I just think it's helpful to understand how they're thinking about it so we can better respond. They are training that this is a simplification of the process, that this will actually make it easier for everyone to have this one standard of CUI rather than the various different marking processes and the various different policies. I have a tough time coming to that same conclusion, but largely from their perspective, they're saying, hey, all these requirements for all these different things were there before. Just because people weren't complying with them doesn't mean the requirements weren't there, and I guess there's some truth to that. But they're training that this is actually a simplification of the process that'll be more clear, more easy to understand, and easier to comply with. I'll let you make your own judgment about whether it's easier to comply with, but that's what they're training their organization, as far as perspective. And finally, I just wanted to give one little example there about how CUI will be marked, because that's a question of many people haven't seen it and what it looked like. I mean, there's contracting officers that don't know what it's looked like. There's CUI that's being put out there that is marked in an inappropriate manner and improper manner. So they're really rolling out training on how to mark it, what the proper markings are, where we should expect to see markings on various types of medium, whether it be an email or a printed document or a sealed folder, or there's all kinds of different standards depending on what the medium is on how it should be marked. And so that training material, and again, we'll give you a reference to that at the end. They have some great examples that show exactly how it should be marked, where it should be marked, and where you should expect to see it. I do caution you, though, back to just because it's not marked doesn't necessarily mean it's not CUI, doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't protect it, but do know where you should be looking for the markings and where you would expect to see it. But it is, again, up to the DoD to mark it. As incumbent upon them to make that happen. But apparently it doesn't remove your responsibility even if it's not marked as CUI.
And I think, Stephen, that to me, the key takeaway there is this training and all of these materials and the graphics you just saw for CUI went live at the 1st of April, just a few days ago. And so the entire organization top down is going through a training on what CUI is and how to recognize CUI and how to label CUI. And they're really at the vanguard of it as compared to other federal agencies. So I think that kind of supports our thought that we're going to see a lot more of this flowing through than what we have in the past. And many of you who didn't think you had CUI may find out that you did, because if they're still learning what is and what is not and getting consistent on labeling process as well, it makes sense that we're going to see a lot more of that flow down through over time. And so that again kind of comes to the discussion earlier on, well, if I'm going to be level 1, do I go on and be level 3? I mean, you need to sit down and kind of look at the training materials that are out there and look at the categories and think through what you'll be doing, or what you hope to be doing and who you hope to be working with, and decide, if I think I might come across it, should I go ahead and start that heavy lift towards the level 3? Or should I just expect that I'll be FCI? I mean, that'll be a decision you'll have to make. I'm happy to have a conversation with if you want to have one. But that's the big piece I think take away is if if we're still going through the training process on labeling it, there's probably going to be more of it showing up on our desks over time.
Yeah, we did see a pullback, because you saw initially a bunch of the contracts come out with the 7012 and the 7021 provisions that were probably inappropriately applied, and that supposedly was only supposed to be on the pilot programs. They got a little further, but you saw a pullback from that from the DoD, and the DoD has even said that that is the case, that they are still in the process, as Jason mentioned, they're still in the process of training their contracting officers on what contract should include those provisions, and how to mark this. This is very much an infancy in their organization, as well as it is with all of us.
And with that, I think we'll move into just talking about the framework, talking about level 1. We'll leave 3 off to the future. We'll do a little bit of discussion perhaps, but we'll leave 3 off to the future, but just kind of a quick breakdown of what level 1 is and how maybe you would approach that and understanding that as well. So in looking at this graphic you've got here, you can see, I mean, just kind of I guess a looking back for folks that aren't familiar with the model, 5 levels there. As you go from level 1 to level 2, it increases the amount of things that you do and increases the amount of requirement that you have. Level 1 is for FCI. Level 2 is that in-between category that I still think a lot of people are trying to figure out exactly who would be level 2 and why they would be level 2, but that's that in-between category from I can handle FCI to I'm ready to handle CUI. Level 3 is where you handle CUI. Level 4 and 5 are typically going to be for much more significant prime contractors, folks that are dealing with pretty heavily sensitive information for that matter as well. But it may be just like any other model. Over time, we may see a kind of a gentle push towards adopting more of these standards. Once we get everybody to level 1, maybe there's a push to get you a little bit further along, or there'll be some updates to the standards and maybe there'll be a few more extra things in there. But as of right now, that's kind of thought. If you're FCI only, you're gonna be at that level 1. It's a pretty easy lift, we think. Level 3, it really gets you to pretty good shape. Level 4 and level 5 is kind of next level. But yeah, if you'll move on to the next slide, please. So another way to kind of hash that out and look at it that maybe helps you understand what it is that's required of you. This is going to break it out by the number of practices involved, and you can see it builds on itself. So level 1 has 17 practices that you have to master. You have to have somebody come in and say, yes, they've done it and they've met these standards, and so they can be certified. Level 2 takes all those, they take the 17, and then they add some additional practices on here, you can see. So each one kind of builds on itself, but you can see the difference between, 17 and 130 practices that you master. That's a big change between level 1 and level 3, and that's why CUI is restricted to that level and FCI is lower. FCI is it's going to require you to do some things, but everything, I think personally, in the level 1 standard is something that we all probably want to aspire to do anyway. Level 3 is going to take a little bit more effort, a little bit more money, a little bit more time, but for some reason, even though the expectation is everybody ought to just go for level 1 unless they're sure they're going to handle CUI, it seems like, as Stefan mentioned, people are really asking questions about, well, how do I get to 3? How can I be to 3? And maybe it is because they see the same thing that we're questioning, is how much CUI is really going to flow down and come to us. But so hopefully this kind of helps you get a perspective of, we'll just be talking about these little 17 practices today, and we won't even go into big detail in them. But that's it. If you can master those 17, if you can convince the assessor that you've got them mastered, then you can get to the point where you'll be certified in a level 1. So that's good. I mean, it's not a heavy lift, but it's a great place to start as we get our feet wet. So if you move on to the next slide, please. So in stepping back, they take all these practices that we were just talking about and they put them in what they call domains, and there's 17 domains. So if you want to achieve everything, if you want to accomplish everything, get to the high level of the standard, you'll have dealt with practices in all 17 of those domains. But for level 1, on the next slide, there's really only going to be 6 that we have to worry about, that we deal with. There's going to be specific things. Now, for access control, for example, there are some additional standards that come in level 2 and level 3, or practices, level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5. But if we just deal with, and we just say, all we're interested in today is understanding what level 1, what we need to get to for level 1 to get ourselves certified to handle federal contract information, we just have to worry about these 6 domains for the moment. So if we'll just kind of keep on cruising on through, the very first domain, access control, is really just going to be about, I mean, it's kind of as it sounds. There's 4 things that when the assessor comes in, they're going to evaluate you on. Now, each one of these things you could write a book on, right? I mean, it's kind of like yeah, here's a little standard, but if you go into the NIST standards and you look at their guides, there are guides that kind of map to these. If you go into the, to the CMMC website on the acquisition department, you can find some things that map to these and say, here's what that would look like. If you go into the assessor guide, there's assessor guides out there, and it'll say, here's what you might see in that AC.1.001. So it's not that it's as simple necessarily as it sounds, but access control is really just going to be focused on making sure that you can control access electronically to the things that users can get to, and that you're protecting those endpoints, and that you have a process delineated out there for accessing things. That's kind of very similar to this next standard, which is identification authentication, which is that not only do you have a process to control that access, but you actually say who is authorized as a user to access those items. And then beyond that, who is actually, how do you authenticate that they are? So if Stefan tries to log in and say, I'm Stefan Reyes, is there a process to say, oh, yep, that really is, he's got something on his machine, or he's got something, password or whatever, some process by which we validate that that person should be accessing it. Both of those really make sense, right? And they're pretty easy to accomplish in many ways. Most of us may have things like this set up in our system, but there's an evaluation process that goes with it. There's this framework out there, and as I mentioned, there's some good guidance in the NIST standard. There's some good guidance on the acquisition website that helps you dig into these specific practices and see, well, what must I actually do to say that, yes, I can identify my information system users and processes. Next domain. So we've kind of already cruised through 2 here. There's 2 in a row that we'll deal with that are kind of physical in a way, and it's a little bit different thinking. It's not cybersecurity. Sometimes you think of as a truly virtual exercise, an electronic exercise, but these next 2 really are going to be a physical process as well, perhaps. Media protection, that's one that we may or may not have really developed a good process for, depending on our size, depending on what industries we've been working with in the past. But ultimately, it's about having a system set up. So if you want to donate your used computer to the school system, for example, you have a system set up to make sure that all the data on there that would be, again, related to, CMMC at least, has been sanitized and deleted. Now, that's a great thing to make sure that we have, regardless of the case, but you need a process set up to sanitize and delete information. You may be pulling hard drives out and drilling through them. You may be you may be paying a company to destroy that for you and give you a certificate, but you'll set up a process to go through that. And that'll be something that, even though in level 1, the way you prove things maybe it always required policy and a strong process, you're going to have to be able to show that, yes, I have something set up to pull these drives, to pull this machine, to make sure that I've sanitized my information systems or my physical machines and gotten this data off. And you could pass that on down into a physical environment as well. If you're printing things off and you have them locked in the cabinet, you need to make sure that you destroy that information as well. It might not just be a virtual perspective. The second piece is, again, thinking in physical, and this is kind of maybe for me, for some reason, it's a step beyond maybe what we expect when we look at a cyber standard. But you're going to have to start thinking through, I mean, this is level 1, this is not level 3. You're going to be thinking through, how do you limit access? Well, locked door, or you have some sort of system that keeps people from coming in, but you're going to limit access to the machines that have the data. You're going to need a process there in that level 2 to say, if a visitor comes in, do I have a practice or policy that says how the visitors, how they come in, how they're escorted, how they're monitored, because I can't just let people wander around where this information might be now. We don't want them to accidentally bump into it or see it, or maliciously bump into it or see it. It's a step beyond the, do I have antivirus, do I have some of these electronic controls? Now we have some physical controls we're talking about. Then that kind of makes sense then with the next one, which is, the 133, which is—
Just if I could, there's one key on that slide you're on there, the maintain audit logs. One of the key differences between your levels 1 and level 3 is we don't have to have any artifacts on level 1, right? We have to have processes and procedures. We don't necessarily have to have artifacts to establish that. And as an assessor, we don't have any we don't have a large amount of requirements for artifacts to create in our work papers to establish what we looked at to validate that level. But this is one area where they specifically list an artifact, even though the condition doesn't require an artifact. This specifically lists one. So that is the one area that logs are mentioned for level 1. And as far as I know, it's the only area of level 1. So it's kind of a special one to me in that portion.
Right, and it's a very interesting, I mean, that's something that we've kind of kicked around ourselves, is somehow the assessor has to get comfortable you doing these things. And in some of these areas, it's almost like you're gonna have to be able to show them that you are doing these things. And the audit logs, that's where they specifically call it out. But if you don't have a policy for escorting visitors, and you don't have a practice for monitoring visitors, and you don't have cameras or some sort of process there, you still are going to have to talk with the assessor, get them comfortable where you're at. And so there's a little bit, and maybe in this process, there's a little bit still to be worked out. And of course, everybody's focused on the level 3 and getting people certified in level 3. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that flows down to the level 1. And then, controlling and managing physical access devices. Boy, that sounds more complicated maybe than it is. But if you have a locked door, I mean, think about, do you have a process to make sure that if you handed out 20 keys, that you know where they're all at, that you know who has them? I mean, that could be a physical access device. It could be your key card. It could be all sorts of different things. But if it's a physical access device, I mean, you need to think through, well, I need to put in a process to make sure that I know where they're at and that I have all of them controlled, because I want to tell that assessor, and I don't want to have to run up against a problem later down the road where it turns out that wasn't true. If I'm going to tell the assessor that, I want this process in place. And that's, maybe that's the big stick behind all this, is the assessor is coming in to assess you in level 1. But ultimately, if you're not really complying with these things, I wouldn't want to be saying that I am, because there's some risk to you, So yeah, I guess for some reason, those two physical kind of things that you're doing just jump out to me as different than what we're used to seeing. The next one here, so systems and communications protection. There's 2 practices here that you're going to follow. Really, it is exactly as it sounds. It's just a process to make sure that you are protecting and monitoring and managing your communications capabilities within the institution, internally and externally as well. And then the very last one, and I should know this off the top of my head, but I don't, is the system and information integrity. And Stefan, I'll take it if you have a suggestion on this, because as I read this is another one of those where there's a lot of, I think there's been some debate on what type of scans are needed, what type of information is needed, but you're almost saying, I'm doing something here, I'm creating an artifact. If I can perform scans of my information system in real time, antivirus, I think is what they're sort of meaning here in many cases. But if I can do this, I'm probably creating some sort of evidence trail. I may want to be able to show that evidence trail. But that is also, depending on how you look at this, identifying, reporting, and correcting flaws in your information system in a timely manner. Some people would read that to say, well, maybe I need some sort of vulnerability scan or some sort of process to be able to identify that information. Some people have kind of stopped short of it. And, but either way, whatever you're doing, you're going to have a process that could be audited. And I would think an assessor might still be interested in seeing how you do that.
Yeah, and even in the other areas as well, you're going to have a process and a procedure that's required. What's not required is that they be written processes and procedures, right? At this level, which is interesting. So yeah, being able to identify how you do that, just because we don't have to have specific artifact requirements for our work papers doesn't mean that there doesn't have to be some demonstration that process is happening. And as you mentioned, Jason, most of these items here, if you're doing them, you're going to generate paperwork or logs or even if it's digital paperwork, but you're going to generate some information that can be used to back up your claims or your assertions that you're doing these items. And that first line item there has been a lot of discussion about what that means. I think it is very difficult for you to say that you're able to identify, report, and correct if you don't have some way to test to see if those exist. So, some type of scanning beyond what we're seeing from the typical PCI scans, that kind of process is going to be required in order for you to establish that level. Now, something we've talked about before as well is, these first iteration of certifications, I expect will have more leniency than they will have over time. I mean, right now they may accept a lower level of established process for this than they will, the next time you go through this process. But certainly at level 3, you're going to be required to have a documented process procedure that's verifiable, as well as as well as evidence that it's being effective. So, you know, there's going to be a requirement for some type of scanning and process and resolution to those issues.
Excellent. And then I think that brings us to the next slide, which is sort of a step back in time in a way of, you know, okay, we've done this, we've kind of looked at the different standards or the different practices that we follow. Well, how should I approach it? You know, maybe I can kind of get comfortable reading all the information out there, but how should I approach this? Well, I think it's like anything else, and I don't want to say the word POA&M, but maybe that makes some sense as we go through this, but you need to perform, or you need to have somebody help you perform just an initial, they call it a pre-assessment, but whatever you want to call it, an initial brush of what am I required to do and where am I? You know, what are my gaps? What are my issues? What are my items? And don't get too focused on, you know, at first, don't get too focused on, well, how would I fix that? Or how would I write that to make it sound like I've remediated it? Just be honest and develop a good list of, well, what should I do? Do I need a key log? We mentioned key logs back there. Do I need a process for that? Do I need these things? How do I get comfortable that I'm doing them so I can comfortably tell somebody else I'm doing them, so I can be comfortable when the assessor comes in that they're going to say, yeah, looks like you're doing it. I give you a checkbox in that. So, you know, figure out everything that must be done, everything that you think you need to do. Then start thinking about, well, how do I move forward with remediation? One would be, I think it's important to kind of take a step back and say, which ones are hardest to accomplish, which are going to take the most time, which are going to take the most money, and maybe prioritize these things. You know, are there some that I need some expert help with, or there's some that are pretty simple, no doubt I can do those myself kind of things that, you know, you want to go ahead and plan for the things that may be harder to get to and get done. And then, you know, then the next thought, and we were talking about a little bit earlier, like level 1, you have to have these things, but you don't really have to prove them in the same manner that you would at level 3. Well, start thinking about your approach. If you know you'll want to be in level 3, but you're going to start with level 1, go ahead and write the policy. It doesn't hurt to have it all documented and written. It doesn't need, you know, you don't always have to have a policy at level 1. You have to have a process that's repeatable and understandable, and, you know, but you don't have to have the policy. But if you know you're going to move towards level 3, a lot of it is that heavy work of proving you're doing the things that you're saying you're doing. And so go ahead and write those policies, write those things into a practice, a repeatable one that you can follow, that you can establish has been around for a long period of time, because that's one of the things about the maturity process here is you also have to establish that you've been doing these things. Not that you started at the day the assessor showed up, but that you actually have developed a maturity in these areas. Therefore, the assessor can say, all right, they've been doing it, they understand what they're doing, the process is well entrenched and in place, I can get comfortable signing off on it. I'll go ahead.
And I was just going to say, don't give up on the POA&M process, because although POA&Ms aren't acceptable for the certification, a certification is a point in time. You know, it is a specific point in time when that visit was done, when that assessment was done. And essentially, we expect that you're going to be reassessed every 3 years. So between that assessment and your next assessment 3 years from now, I think the POA&M is the way to keep yourself in process. And it's not going to stay the way it was that day. There's going to be changes, there's going to be updates, and you need to have a way to continue to work that process. And I'm suggesting you build that in now, as kind of as Jason said before, thinking for the future. If you build yourself into that process where you're identifying these items, finding your gaps, establishing POA&Ms, working towards completion of those, if that becomes a normal part of your process, you know, then you'll have a key date of when your assessment happens, where all these POA&Ms will have to be cleared for whatever level you're being certified for. But those, you'll come back to that. You continue to use that process to maintain compliance throughout that period of 3 years until you're assessed again.
Very true. I think that brings us to, you know, kind of the last new slide, and then we'll have kind of a closing thoughts one after that. But one more concept maybe to put in front of you haven't seen. So when an assessment is performed, when you get to that point that you have somebody come in and perform, and they're looking at those practices and evaluating where you stand, the assessor has their hand tied a little bit, and we've mentioned that, but they really get the option of saying 3 things. Either you met the standard, or the practice, either you met it, or you didn't meet it. You know, in other words, there's some work left to do, or it's not applicable. You know, not applicable makes sense. It's just something that doesn't fit for you, and it doesn't apply. But if you don't have all mets and not applicable, you're not going to get that certification. You're going to be put into either a Delta process or you're going to be put into some sort of, you have to wait and fix it and come back again later in the future. So it's not like, that's the difference. I mean, we haven't been talking about it, but the POA&Ms left you some ability to say, I recognize I need to do this, but I'm going to work towards it. Here's my plan for it. Here's my milestone. Here's how I'm going to get there. This is at this point in time today, at this moment, I'm looking and you've met it or you've not met it. And if you've not met it, then you've not met it. I think, am I correct in that, Stefan? Or
yeah, and they drilled through the process as well as through the training for assessor training that they're not applicable. I mean, they almost didn't want us to have it. You know, they kept going back and forth about whether it was there, whether there's really a purpose for not applicable, but it's meant to be so narrow. And remember, even after the assessor completes the assessment, they'll submit it to the AB, and the AB will review the assessment for acceptance and certification. And that's one of the things they'll be looking for is the use of not applicable. There's some real thoughts about how that almost shouldn't be available except in very extreme circumstances. And you know, an example I give of that is you know, they suggestion that you need to secure all your wireless networks. People say, well, what if I don't have any wireless networks? That should be not applicable. And others are saying, well, no, it's not applicable. It's not that it's not applicable. You should have a policy and a procedure that states you don't have wireless, and that if you would have wireless, it would be secured, or that you don't allow it because that's how you secure it. So therefore, it is secured. You know, there's just different ways they're trying to get around that not applicable, but don't think that's going to be an acceptable response in a very very wide set of circumstances. It is really narrow. So met or not met is established what the options are really. Either you met or you have not met it.
Gotcha. And then I think that brings us to resources. I'm not gonna go through this except to point out that at the DoD-CUI.mil is the training that we talked about, that they're putting their professionals through, and you can take it. And the way we read it almost sounds like you're probably going to have to at some point take it anyway. So it's it looks like you're going to spend an hour on it. You're not going to spend 3 days. You know, you can take it, get a good understanding of how others are being trained to identify it. And if you know how they're being trained to identify it, then hopefully you'll be able to as well, and you'll kind of get a good concept of the process. So take a look at that site, and if you have time, go through that. And then otherwise, there's 3 kind of key takeaways that I think, you know, we'll just quickly mention, and it won't take long at all. If you want to be certified, it makes sense to go ahead and start this process soon. Take a look at these practices and see where you stand, and start to build your list of what you think you need to do and how you think you need to get there. It'll save you time and money long term to be preparing early. And don't get caught up. There's a lot of people that are sure they can get you certified. No one can get you certified right now. Everybody's still kind of working through that process. But you can start understanding what's required, and you can start building your environment to be closer to where you want to be. You know, have a plan for, we mentioned it earlier, but it could save you time and money. Have a plan for, if you don't need your entire network to have this information, have a plan for segregating it off so you don't have to have everything assessed. And then I do think it's important, go back and take that training. We mentioned it, it's free, it's available, and it's a great resource. With that, unless you have something else, Stefan, we'll turn over to Nancy and let her close us out.
Nope, that is it.
Excellent.
Hi, well, thank you guys for taking the time to share this great information. We will follow up with today's materials and recording via email. You should receive that in your inbox tomorrow. And as we mentioned, if you didn't get a chance to see our previous CMMC webinars, you can find them on our Resource Center under Information Technology or on our YouTube channel. And we are keeping an eye out on the CMMC developments, so be on the lookout for more information on Part 4. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to contact any one of us, and we'll get right back to you. Thanks again for joining.
Thank you.